Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rich. Tonight we have three guests on, which is unusual, and I'm really looking forward to talking to all three of you concerning mutual aid and specific organizations throughout the Chicagoland area and thereof, and what exactly you do. So without further ado, we have Andrew, we have Chi, and we have Glaciella in that order. If you go my right down to the left. Welcome to the show, everybody.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having
Absolutely.
us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So, okay, anybody want to take the reins here and start the conversation off with what is it? What does mutual aid mean? What do you do? Anyone at all? Graciela, how about you start us off?
Sure. Well, hi everyone. I'm Graciela. My pronouns are she, her, they, yes, with Beaumont Cragen Mutual Aid. And at its finest, I talk about mutual aid work as community folk really coming together to solve problems that we see around us from a community-based perspective. So that means it's relational. It lifts up the gifts that we have as individuals in our community. It acknowledges that there are structures and powers and systems that are bigger than us that are failing everyday people.
That's true.
And that we are best positioned to be able to resolve those by working with each other.
That's really interesting and very refreshing to hear that there are organizations out there like that. So can you give me like an example or two of something that, like, you're living in a specific community, you're part of this mutual aid coalition, something in your community happens. Give me an example of what might happen that you would respond to and try to help with.
Maybe I can take this one, Glacia.
Chi, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Chi. My pronouns are he and him. I've been mostly active in the Irving Park Mutual Aid group that's serving the community mutual Irving Park. So I think I started joining it at the beginning of the pandemic, and there's a lot of fear at the beginning, and there's a lot of people afraid to go out to go grocery shopping, and there's also a lot of mask shortages. So one of the earliest things we started doing was just to get to people groceries, because some people don't want to come out. And I think there's also a lot of activity about making masks and delivering masks. So that's one of these things that we try to respond at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that need has been evolving throughout the last 2 years. I think many of us have other examples of things in our own community.
Sure, there are a lot of examples, yeah. But that's really interesting. Andrew, do you have any other examples to add to the list?
I'm Andrew. Use he, him pronouns. I'm from Portage Park Mutual Aid. And yeah, the pandemic was really a big factor in our mutual aid groups forming and coalescing as a sort of Northwest coalition. As far as the pandemic goes, it was a factor of some people couldn't go out because they're highly at risk of what would happen if they caught COVID, but also there were a lot of people affected economically, lost their jobs, or were laid off or furloughed and couldn't afford their regular bills at the start of the pandemic either. So that was a huge driving force in what spurred our groups into action.
That's very cool. How do you get a measure of the need in a community? Like, how would you know that, like, this person, this house need masks, or this house needs food because like they're not willing to go out, or so? Like, how do you figure all that out? How do you get that data?
I think initially our groups, they can each speak to how we got the word out initially in different ways. But yeah, for us, it was really just putting up flyers in the neighborhood and posting on like neighborhood social media, like Facebook groups.
Oh, great. So you put up flyers in social media and stuff, just saying, hey, we exist as a mutual aid organization. We're here to help in case of crises or desperation or anything like that. And then they just go through the links to the social media pages, contact you that way, say, hey, I'm, elderly. I don't have the wherewithal to go outside during this, and I need groceries. Can you help me? Like something that straightforward?
Yeah, that, and we also did a little bit of phone banking at the very beginning. We there's publicly available like registered voters, and we filtered by our zip code and people over 65 to start with. Most of those folks that we reached out to, a lot of the time they were just happy to talk to somebody, but we did end up connecting with a few of them that had concrete needs for like asking for masks or help with food.
That's great. And then how do you say delegate who's going to, okay, I'm going to go, Andrew, you're going to go ahead and get the groceries for this house. Chi, you're going to get some masks for this house. Like, how do you allocate who does what?
Maybe it's a good time to just like back it up a step and I think talk about the beauty of the mutual aid work is that it is very, very hyper local. Mm-hmm. So what that means is, Andrew's talking about outreach and phone banking, and Belmont-Cragen, it looked really different. A lot of the families that we serve are multi-status immigrant families, are monolingual Spanish speakers, or have active disabilities. Point is, a lot of the strategies that Andrew worked didn't work for our population. So we had to be one-on-one, very like hyper-relational with our folks. Okay. So all to say that, though that being said, though there was a high level of tracking, the ways that he's talking about us being able to do wellness checks on families and make sure that we're having these conversations where they're telling us, hey, this week we do have COVID, we do need masks, we do need food. Next week, hey, we're actually good, we don't need any of these items, but can you follow up with us in 2 weeks? There is a fair amount of sophistication and tracking in the mutual aid community that's been a best practice that allows us to really be able to map out what our neighbors need on a weekly basis. And we've been able to leverage a really wide network of volunteers that help across a continuum of things. So people that help us be able to rescue the food, for example, that we construct on a weekly basis to queue up for delivery, folks that sign up to be able to deliver food directly to families and individuals, for example, folks that opt to take it to community spaces where it can be a part of bigger events or community distribution as opposed to delivery. So the beauty is that we get to look at our community and say, we think this is the strategy that would work best, and then work with neighbors to create the base of people that actually do the thing.
Gotcha. Very cool. Okay, well, thank you for that very elaborate explanation. That's very cool. The notion of mutual aid it strikes me as familiar, just the concept in two different areas other than specifically what you're doing, but I think it ties in. Mutual aid you hear a lot in like modern day biological interpretations of animals and species instead of the whole Darwinian supposed like, natural selection and fittest species wins. It's actually more of a mutual aid amongst species and interspecies and that kind of thing. You're hearing that more and more and more. Also, mutual aid in like political philosophy is sort of another term for socialism, Marxism, communism, or even anarchism because of its massive decentralization. A lot of modern day anarchists would call themselves mutual aidists. I don't know if you've heard that phrase before, but it sounds to me like it's one of the things you're talking about. Graciela, you mentioned this earlier about how like these bigger than us systems are failing us all the time. It's like one of the general driving forces of modern day anarchist philosophy is that governments in general are like a bad idea. And that decentralization is always a better idea. Local communities taking care of themselves and each other within it is actually a much better, just even logistically, if not exactly, specifically morally as well, than sort of like top-down authority or schematics or logistics. Now, does this mutual aid, these coalitions here, or does this come from any of those philosophical notions, or is this something independent that happened on its own? Okay, Andrew, go ahead. Or Chi.
It looked like Chi was going to say something.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have some sort of maybe my personal philosophical sort of root of this. I think it does resonate with some of the things you were saying about decentralization. And right. I think also going back to what Gracia was saying earlier was, I think it's a way of thinking of how communities can behave and communities right. can bond together. And that, at least personally, as a sort of an urbanite kind of person, it helps me understand who my neighbors actually are and give me a chance to actually know them. And I think that in itself it sounds like it shouldn't be radical, right? It sounds like it shouldn't be strange.
Isn't this what we all should be doing? Is helping each other when you're in need?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Isn't that a basic moral notion? I mean, come on, right? Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's something about the existing structure that makes that actually hard, and I think that's something that as a philosophic like way to organize the world, that we're kind of challenging that notion that this shouldn't be radical to sort of say I want to know my neighbors, and in the way that helps us understand the needs of the neighborhood, the needs of my community, better than having some kind of top-down person coming down and say, oh, you guys need this, but instead of having the needs coming from the bottom up.
Right. Exactly.
Great. And if I really quickly build from Chi, I think as a framework, mutual aid really has like 3 core tenets in it, right? I think we've talked about the first one, that there's human needs that aren't being met, and that mutual aid and its projects, its strategies, our creativities, like how it is that we approach like these problems, not only aim to help people survive, but more importantly, to really create this shared understanding amongst all of us about that humanity and why it is that people don't have what they have. So if it's structural, if it's powers, what is it that is not allowing us to have what we need to have? That's number 1. 2, these projects, they're really important beyond the act of allowing survival, because we get to mobilize community, we get to mobilize each other, we get to expand solidarity and connection and build movements that produce changes beyond the solutions that we're engaging in. And then lastly, right, I think she said this best, like, we're not out here to be saviors. We're not out here to say that we have the best solution individually, rather to say that the way of the future, the way that we transform reality is through participation and cooperation, which is very, very different than government and the structures that are out there that tend to make us feel not human, that force us into lack of relationships, that focus isolation at the expense of our humanity and shared needs. So I call those 3 things because I think, across the mutual aid community, there's all kinds of political ideologies, but at its core, I think we're really talking about a lot of the same things. Folks are out there, they're in a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, they don't have what they need. Here we are as neighbors that are really rooted and driven by that. And then 3, we have a responsibility to not only meet those needs, but through popular education and any other means possible, change reality together.
Well, all right. That's very cool. I like well said. So speaking of, it being perceived as radical, have you run into any antagonism? Any people like, okay, this is just weird, I don't like this? Any pushback from anybody, whether it be in the community, police? I watch videos a lot. I do a lot of research on policing in America. And I came across a video a couple of weeks ago where there was this chef. I mean, he was like an executive chef, set up this buffet out in a park to feed the homeless. And he got arrested. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. And there's a ton of stories about police arresting people trying to help other people. It's ridiculous because the laws are saying that you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. Have you ever been confronted with anything like that? Any one of you?
I personally haven't, but I think there are some existing powers that definitely look frowned upon to some of the stuff we do. But I think I'll let other people share too.
Andrew, how about you?
I don't think not quite to that scale. We have received from time to time comments to the effect of, you guys should be focusing on like addressing crime or like speaking out about crime going on in our neighborhood. And my thought to that is, in a way we are, we're not advocating for heavier policing than we already deal with. Not at all. We're more of the school of thought that what we could do could possibly help people in a way so that they're not, we're trying to address the root causes ultimately. What we're doing with food rescue and food distribution is just a small step in that direction, but that's where we're coming from.
Okay. Graciela?
Maybe I'll just really quickly build on that. I think just to say that obviously, like we're presenting like as a Northwest Coalition, like a really specific point in time about mutual aid work, but some of our mutual aid comrades, like out in the South, for example, when you think about when George Floyd, Ferguson, all those instances were happening, and Chicago, was shutting off bridges and access to food and meals within schools, for example. What they were doing out there, the same act of rescuing and provision of food was seen as absolutely retaliatory because what they were doing was allowing Southside residents that really needed access to food and materials and basically were under certain forms of martial law because of what the city's response were. To not have what they needed. Mutual aid allowed those neighbors to have what they needed. So by any flip of the coin, I think right now we happen to be viewed favorably by some forms of government that because of the pandemic choose to view this work favorably. But in the same way, these strategies at any point, in that example, the same exact notion was viewed very, very negatively and with pushback. I'll also lift up, we talked about other forms of mutual aid, but there is a branch in Chicago that does a lot of organizing within the jail system, so Chicago Jail Support. And so they directly, I won't speak for their experiences, and I think maybe invite, that there should be an active conversation with them. But, I know that they've had in various levels of engagement directly with police anytime that they organize. So I think to say that broadly as a coalition, we have really specific notions about what community care should look like over policing. And it's something that we have to be very vocal about at any point of intervention.
Okay, very, very interesting. I that's interesting that there's a mutual aid organization coalition that deals with they go directly into the jails and help the prisoners out, like just by talking to them, helping them. But you didn't want to speak for them. That's fine.
Yeah, the jail support. I mean, I can't speak for them because I never done it myself. But what I know is that there is at least the group I know, the jail support folks. They are actually outside of Cook County Jail, and they help people who need transportation getting bailed out.
Oh, very cool.
So that's one of the things they do. And there's
people when they just get out of jail,
Mhm.
like they'll offer them rides, or they'll Gatorade, cigarettes, anything like that.
Oh, that's great. Wow, that's really neat. Are you associated, if you are directly connected to any sort of external organizations, like, when people need help, like the Red Cross, Salvation Army, any local churches or charities that help you with that, or are you independent of all that?
We do work with pantries. We source food in a lot of different ways, and the food pantry network is definitely a part of that.
Yeah, there's I think a number of local organizations that we're partner of. Depends on the sort of different neighborhoods and different places. I think Irving Park at some point we were talking to the alderman's office as well, and a few churches we know. And like there's one day where CPS canceled school and there was a scramble to get food. So I think there's like one day we had we literally have volunteers go out to get food and have a local church serving as like a drop-off point. So there's many other organizations that I think part of that idea of building that network is to kind of know where these organizations are and see what their capacities are like and what they need. And sometimes we're not, in a sense, we are independent from them, but in other sense that we're also connected to them because we're not like in opposition with them. Because
Right.
If people on the ground has been doing similar kind of work that has been doing it well, then we definitely want to partner with them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There are plenty of churches are, known for being very charitable and that kind of thing, and having food pantries, free clothing, and there's a lot of activity in the churches around here, which is very cool. It's cool to see that happening. Yeah, you may.
If I may, though, I think Chi's point, though, about the ways that we do engage, though, there are some really important corners as values that we set aside. Like, I think for us, we really principally believe in solidarity over charity. So I say that because our driving force, like how we do our work, why we do it, the ways in which we choose to not partner with specific entities or to some extent like philanthropy and outside structures is important because while we certainly do want to make sure that folks have what they need, there are some partnerships and some strategies that we just won't do because again, like we really want to make sure that neighbors can have what they need without having to go above and beyond hurdles that nonprofits ask them to do, for example. They might ask for extra documentation or might make people do extra hurdles because that is what is demanded of them in that structure. And I think I also lift up like the praxis, like what drives us is again that relational aspect that like there is human need that is not being met, and we're bridging that through solidarity as opposed to a savior complex that benefits structures that allow themselves to feel good for substandardly helping people when it should just be their practice. So I lift that up to say we absolutely like will partner with folks, but we also don't believe in charity as a part of how we do our work.
No, that's a very interesting distinction too, and very well spoken. The difference between solidarity and charity. You're right. Charity is again like a top-down sort of, a system. It's still hierarchical, right? Instead of solidarity, where it's literally people working together, to make sure that everybody's needs are met and that kind of thing. That's very well said. Can I ask what your individual experiences were or motives were to get involved in these things? You're each from different parts of you all live in Chicago?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, but you live in different parts. You're parts of different, like there's Northwest Mutual Aid Coalition, there's Irving Park, Portage Park, right? So you're each part of a different sector,
Right,
if you will.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Andrew, why don't you kick it off? How did you get involved? When did you get involved, and why did you get involved?
Actually, jumping off of what Graciela said, I have and continue to volunteer at a food pantry for a few years. And when these groups were forming almost a couple years ago now, which is wild to think about, we're almost coming up on 2 years.
Yeah.
The pandemic.
Yeah.
I saw it as an opportunity to do similar work but with people that I was possibly more politically and ideologically aligned with. And for a lot of the reasons that Graciela listed before, I do value the work that the other group that I work with does, but I think the model that we're building is really something to lift up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, generosity is a virtue. I mean, it's hard to blame somebody for, fault somebody for helping other people. But the system that it's within, like Graciela was saying, is just in itself is again it's too hierarchical. You could solve a lot of these problems by getting rid of these systemic hierarchies, for sure. Chi, what about you? How'd you get involved?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think some of the things Graciela was saying earlier was. Sorry, I'm going to answer your question too.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fine. Do whatever.
I think what I heard that was very interesting to me was like, I think some of the other organizations which put up some barriers for people to get help, and that people who are actually not able to cross or not willing to cross these barriers or these hurdles, I actually end up being precisely the kind of community that we end up being able to help. And so I think there's actually there's some idea there. I think we're kind of filling some of the gaps. I think people are getting low over. So I think that's an important point, at least for me. But I think I came to this work. I think partly in the beginning it was selfish. Honestly, is during the pandemic, and I was in a place that I feel like I'm kind of hopeless. I feel like the system has failed us. I think there's definitely a sense of anger and frustration and powerlessness, and also being a person that is here as an immigrant. I didn't feel like I have a lot of electoral power or being really engaged in the electoral politics of the community I was in. So I feel like I want to be involved in something else.
Okay.
More hands-on and what's in the community. I think I got connected to mutual aid through some of the online activism that I saw in Chicago. And I think there was like a email form at the very beginning, a Google form that had people sign up. And I think that's where everything started. And for me, that was a really interesting way to actually feel like I'm a citizen that is actually lived in the city. I think before this, I never had that kind of feeling. Even though I've been here for a couple of years now, in the States for a couple of years in Chicago. I think it really kind of opened my eye about like what does it mean for people to have power and for us individually to actually exercise these powers. And sometimes we get socialized into a place where we don't think we have this power.
Right.
And I think being in this kind of organization, especially because mutual aid is a very non-hierarchical, there are times where I feel like, wow, we actually have to make consensus. We have to make decisions that I'm not used to, even though I've been in the professional world for a long time, or I've been in academia for a long time, where it's easy to sort of be in that hierarchy because in a professional world, you have a boss, you have a manager, and you have people you manage. In this kind of world, in this practice where you're actually feel much more like your peers, you're among peers,
right,
and you make decisions based on just talking, and that's in some sense almost like this is what democracy should be. Actually,
that's 100% what it should be.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. Yeah. People reasoning together and coming up with a consent on policy. Okay, sorry about that. Yes.
No, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, very interesting. Do you mind if I ask where you're from? What country you're from?
I grew up in China and also in Canada.
Oh, right on.
So I feel like I've spent a third of my life in 3 different countries now. So China, Canada.
That is definitely some massive cultural differences there. So that's makes you very well rounded culturally. That's actually very cool. I like that.
Thanks.
Graciela, how about what's your testimony? Your backstory?
Sure. So I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I was born the daughter of 2 immigrants that had escaped the Salvadorian Civil War. So I say that because my neighborhood growing up was all refugee and asylee. So that we grew up with a fair mistrust, with good reason, for structures, nonprofits, and governments that had failed us. And frankly, I grew up with mutual aid, and I talk about a lot of that because I think there's a deep history and tapestry of that. And I think there's a lot of notable examples in Chicago, and a lot of folks think about like Black Panthers and other public programs that have started as a part of mutual aid. But I talk about a lot as a simple act of community. Maybe it was a week that my family had extra rice and the family across the way had extra bean. And there was a cooperation that happened between us to make sure that both of our families got fed. Sometimes it was the ways in which my mom acknowledged that I had learned to read in English and that there were neighbors around me that didn't, and she would send me to go translate in the clinic. There were 5 of us kids at home, and that meant that we could babysit for other folks as they were going on job interviews or, as they were trying to get their bearings and footing going in the country. So I say that to say that I grew up with that very strong vision that community was what was going to get us through, and did. Yeah. And so when the pandemic happened, I had already been working in healthcare organizing a long time in Chicago. It was no surprise that the communities that had the highest rates were the communities that had been the most disenfranchised, not just in healthcare, but in every other way possible. It was around that time that Kelly Hayes, another Chicago-based organizer, made that call for us to really organize hyper-locally to help form mutual aid networks where there were none, to bridge where there were. And so I really became involved in Belmont-Cragen as a community that I had done a lot of work with, was living in at that moment, and was facing extraordinary rates of COVID without a mutual aid network, and really saw an opportunity to just bridge with neighbors and figure out what we could do together.
Well, that's very cool. How do these specific coalitions, like the Irving Park Mutual Aid, Portage Park, so on, get started? Like you were talking, Graciela, about getting involved in that and stuff like that. How does it get started in the first place? Is there like a national kind of charter and then the little sects amongst, or is it completely decentralized, right? Like it just sort of pops up So like somebody says, I'm going to start a mutual aid group in Irving Park, and
Yeah, she was talking about it a little bit, but there was a Google form circulating at the start of the pandemic, and people filled it out, and by what neighborhood you were in, you were linked up with people.
Well, like who made that form and sent it out? Say.
I think it was Kaylee Hayes, right?
Okay.
Kelly Hayes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think she, and I'm sure she didn't invent this thing. I think there's around that time there was a lot of instructions about neighborhood pods, and if you've seen these social media posts about how do you start your own neighborhood pods, I think I saw that. Excuse me, and I think also Katie Hayes, who's based in Chicago, had I think Austin just dropped out.
She's having phone issues. She'll be right back.
So she had that form, and I think everybody who signed up put their neighborhoods on there. I think she and probably some other volunteer basically group people by the neighborhoods and basically connect everybody in the same neighborhood. And I think that at the same time as people building neighborhood pods, which are kind of like building your own tiny group chat thing in your own apartment building or your own block. These two things combined, at least when I was in Irving Park, that seems to be two things that's overlapping. So I don't think there was a national organization that has like, oh, we're going to start one here and we're going to, you're the leader. Right. Yeah, it's very, very grassroots, and whoever was active at that time in that group became sort of more active.
Okay.
And I think people kind of, each of us kind of gravitated just organically into sort of individual roles of, okay, this person seems to do this more and I like to do this more. There wasn't any sort of top-down way that somebody said, oh, I'm going to be the social media person. I'm going to be the person that makes phone calls.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. But in your respective, like the Portage Park, Irving Park, how many members do you do? Okay. Is it a membership type thing? You talked about filling out a form. Is there some sort of like formal commitment to it, or is it just really that sort of spontaneous and organic, like people kind of look at it when they feel like it and help when they can?
It's not extremely formal. Certainly at the Northwest Coalition level, we have some community agreements that we ask people to agree to before they join our Slack. And even at the Portage Park level, we have some community agreements. We've had people come and go when they decided that they weren't aligned with our values anymore. But it's not extremely formal. We have like a handful of people that'll regularly attend meetings, but then we have a handful more people who will come in and pick up food or deliver food, on a regular or semi-regular basis. So, I'm just speaking for Portage. I can only speak for Portage Park in that regard.
Sure. Graciela, anything to add to that, or?
Yep, I think just to say, I think the base of like consistent folks that are organizing across the mutual aid, we're a part of several coalitions. So I think about like the Chicagoland Food Sovereignty Coalition, for example, that brings together mutual aids across the broader Chicagoland. So not just Chicago, but some of the suburbs. And so that's, a couple of hundred folks. And when you add our delivery drivers, folks that help with rescue, some of the organizations and partners that, Chi and Andrew have discussed, we're in the several hundreds. But I think just to say that we're more in the game of like sustainability, how it is that through community and relationship building, we can keep these bonds together that keep us working with each other. How can we grow the base of people that understand mutual aid and its tenets? And then more importantly, find this as the way that they want to organize with each other. So all to say that we're hoping to find more like-minded people that, want to have this be their vantage point in ways that they operate in the world.
All right, very cool. So this is a Green Party show, and Green Party is called the Green Party because it's very concerned and focused on environmental issues. In mutual aid or coalitions, is there any sort of attempts towards anything concerning the environment? I'm trying to think of like what I know about you now, and I don't know, picking up trash in parks or something. I mean, do you reach out in any capacity like that, or?
I
Chi.
think.
Graciela, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm a chatty person. If you can't.
No,
tell.
that's great. No, that's great. They
Uh,
waited for you. They wanted to make sure you were on tonight.
I appreciate
And now
it.
I know why.
No, I think there's certainly a lot of we believe in a lot of inter-issue solidarity, right? Just acknowledging that while we are talking about survival, we can't acknowledge survival if we're only talking about one kind of survival, right? So you'll see us lift up rallies, causes, other ways that we can help promote movement building. And I think while we don't necessarily have a sector of the mutual aid work out of at least the Northwest Coalition that specifically focuses on environmental stuff, we're trying to think about how can we be supports to the environmental movement, whether that be space, sharing food, other ways. So we're all ears on hearing ways in which we can partner. But I will say that when you think about our food rescue work and the way that works, right, there's so much food that's going to waste. And when we think about impact environmentally and also in our community, that's one of the ways that we really feel we can meaningfully make a change on something that is going to waste. One. Two, that a lot of the corporations and businesses and enterprises that are causing environmental harm are also some of the biggest actors and players causing this kind of waste, and that we can take them to task. Through popular education and through, what it is that we're doing through rescue. So I'd say that to say that I think there's a lot more opportunity for us to be bridging and working in solidarity, but that's one of the examples that came to mind.
Okay, yeah, very cool. So, Andrew, tell me about one of the meetings you spoke of. What does a meeting look like?
Well, mostly these days they're on Zoom.
Well, sure.
At the Portage Park level, we meet every other week to discuss what we have going on just within our neighborhood. At the Northwest side level, we meet every week, typically to discuss how are we sourcing food that week, how are we distributing food that week. We've there's been a lot of moving parts as time has gone on. We had one space initially that we were using for a long time that we eventually had to move out of. We've been kind of operating without a permanent home for a while, and that's presented a lot of challenges that we've managed to overcome. We're just on the cusp of moving into our next permanent home, which is very exciting.
So you do have a brick and mortar kind of location where you all can gather together outside of the pandemic.
Yeah, currently we've been distributing food just out of a parking lot of a friendly organization on the Northwest side. We store food during the week at a hub in Pilsen that's used by the Chicagoland Food Sovereignty Council broadly. So that's groups all over the city that are using that space. But pretty soon we're going to have our own space to store stuff closer to the Northwest side.
Well, that's great. So I just real quick, Graciela, to go back and you talk about accepting ideas and about supporting the environmental movement and so on. I am certified in horticulture, and I think local organic gardens is a big way to do that. Just throwing that out there. Take it, do whatever you want.
Ooh, no, that's a beautiful idea because in
community
in the summer,
gardens.
Yes, in the summer though, there was a lot of energy and around helping build garden beds. Number one, two, how do we get neighbors to want to adopt them and to really make them, more community led? So that could be a really beautiful idea. And I think obviously it just got cold and we got.
Well, yeah. If it's something you want to do, you have time to figure out how you're going to do it. And let me know if you need any help. I could probably help you. And kids love it too. It's a great way to get kids together. They love playing in the dirt and learning about that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of fun. Horticulture is a lot of fun, and it's so needed nowadays. If we can get going back to this decentralization thing in all areas of life, if people can start growing their own food, they're going to be better off. 100%. And fresh, just out of purely aesthetic level, fresh always tastes better. Oh man, my family's from Italy. We grew tomatoes, and I made tomato sauce right off the vine. You got to be kidding me! It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable.
If I may add a little bit, yeah, we actually had we used to have a lot more space. We used to have a warehouse space that we were able to store food and all that. But one of the groups in that space, when we had that space, was what we call the Build Squad. And what they do is there's woodwork and there's tools, and people coming and build all sorts of things. And one of the things people were building was these lot fridges. You might have seen it if you're in some areas in Chicago, where we'll put the fridge out on the street and it's nicely decorated, and we'll be able to staff it. Sorry, not staff it. To shelf it. So there's always there's always food there. And I think one of the projects that we're working on before we lost that space, which I hope that we're going to get it back into that groove this year, it was actually, I think, was building gardening apparatuses. Mm-hmm. So I think there's definitely an interest there as well.
Oh, great. Very cool. Yeah. So we have Jennifer Vietz says yard shares. I'm assuming that's an idea. I don't know what a yard share. I mean, I have an idea, but I don't know for sure. Does anybody else want to chime in on what a yard share is? Is it like a yard sale, but instead of selling it, you just come up and take whatever you need?
We actually had I think we had this thing we call it a free store, and we ran it a few times. And there's actually a location in Humboldt Park that's almost like a semi-permanent presence in the community, where we used to give a lot of donations of all kinds of goods, a lot of clothing, a lot of other sort of everyday grocery type of goods. And then we put it up in the space. I think we had one that ran for a weekend where we gave out a lot of clothes. I think the one in Humboldt Park, it's been operating for quite a while now. It's basically what you think of as a store, but except it's free.
That's cool. Sorry.
Yeah, we would hope to be able to have something like that once we have our new warehouse space up and running a bit. But yeah, the free store in Humboldt Park has been running for a while, and we have had pop-up free stores over the summer. We had one when we had the stuff to stock it with.
Neat. That's very cool. Graciela, any comments on any of that?
No, I think you're hearing, I think when I think about us at our finest, it's finding projects that, one, bring neighbors together, two, give people what they need, and three, allow us to flex our creative muscle. Like, that's really when you see us at our happiest, because we also really believe in building community joy. So like the idea of like the community gardens, like the free stores, like I think you're really seeing, us trying to figure out like how can we continue pulling neighbors together, not just to do things, but also to be with each other. Yeah. And to really restore a lot of what's been taken from us throughout, so much of this pandemic and beyond that.
Yeah, that's no. So I'm assuming that the mutual aid thing has existed before the pandemic, right? I mean, this isn't merely a response to the pandemic. Give me like one or two examples of the massive differences between pre-pandemic mutual aid and current mutual aid within the pandemic. Anyone? Graciela.
Sure. I think I would again say that like a lot of like pre-pandemic mutual aid organizing, like it existed, it was robust, but maybe it wasn't as visibilized. The pandemic gave us that platform. It also honestly gave us the opportunity to figure out amongst each other, because just think about like a food insecurity coalition now all of a sudden has 100 people thinking dedicatedly about like how do we disrupt food in this city in a given week, right? Like that wasn't necessarily the case before. Some of the bridges that we've been able to make between the North and the South and the West, those didn't necessarily exist before too. Sure. So I say that because like, there was a history in Chicago. It maybe wasn't as connected and as visible as it is now, but I also say that because we will continue to exist post this pandemic, despite, what, especially right now, like I think as people, in some ways talk about this variant or what's going to happen after COVID, I really say like the legacy is that mutual aid will continue to endure, that we will continue to persevere and find ways to continue to do what we do, that we're not going away just because someone deems that the pandemic has gone away or not. So yeah, that's all I would lift up about that.
Okay, very cool. Very interesting. Is it at all legally affiliated, these mutual aid coalitions? Is there any sort of funding that goes into it? I mean, you're talking about brick and mortar places, warehouses. I'm assuming somebody somewhere has to pay for that. Or is it actually donated to you? Is everything donated?
Yeah, I think we have fundings from a variety of sources. A lot of it is donations from the community itself. And I think at the beginning, a lot of us were using GoFundMe, other sort of online platforms. Right now, a lot of the financial sort of funding was through Open Collective, which is a website, also organization that are, I think they act as fiscal hosts for a lot of the organizations that are too small to apply for the nonprofit status. So Open Collective itself have a nonprofit status, and I think a lot of our funding was sort of being sort of handled by they are handling it as a proxy for us. I think Gracia and Andrew, you probably have more to speak of about how we're dealing with the warehouse situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to acknowledge, right, that, you know, in a lot of our mutual aid values, we are very much anti-capitalist. We don't want to function with money. So I think we will absolutely pursue every single venue that we can to do this work without money, which is why we rescue, while acknowledging that, like, we're about to throw down $108,000 for a warehouse for 3 years, right? So I say that because, you know, for example, one of the really important values when we are having to engage with money is that we see fundraising as, again, another opportunity to be relational. So we refuse to take money from corporations or for the most part, from philanthropy. We really try to focus on one-on-one donations from neighbors, which is why, for example, for this campaign for the warehouse, the average donation from neighbor to neighbor was less than $100. And we were able to achieve that goal really through that collective push for how can we build a space in the Northwest Side to help us be able to do this work, to be able to do movement building, to have a hub. So I say that to say that we obviously, we're not a nonprofit. We don't have a 501c3. We try to figure out how we can flex with partners that have that designation when we need it. It's come up from time to time as we're trying to get bigger and it's stronger. Yeah. But for the most part, we really are trying to not replicate these structures that exist out there, and that means that we push to remain as independent and as unaffiliated as we can.
I love that. I love how you started off with your anti-capitalist. That's one of my most favorite phrases. I recently, I have a different show, and I interviewed somebody, and at some point I said something about how I hate money, and she didn't understand what I meant. I'm like, it's, you know, the monetary value is not an objectively real thing. It doesn't exist. I mean, it's just ridiculous how money has absolutely taken over everybody's life. You know, we live for it, we die for it, we kill for it, and it's not real. It's just not real. It's really annoying. Anyway, okay, well, very cool. So we got about 7, 8 minutes left here. I would, anything before I do have a closing question. Anything you want to talk about that I might have missed? Graciela, if you want to, anything that important you want to plug?
I think just to say that, you know, when we were talking about mutual aid, like a lot of people, again, you know, I think Chi's point and Andrew's point that we really function with our hierarchy is important, because it means that there is a place for everyone and for everything. I say that because, like, some of us, like, when we're held up in a certain kind of way because we've been doing mutual aid with each other for a while. But I say, like, 2 years ago, I didn't know Chi or Andrew. I literally didn't. I hadn't been in a U-Haul rescuing food. I knew nothing about food insecurity or mutual aid world, and now this is my world. And so I say that because I think we're constantly like, who else can we lift up in our community? What else are we not seeing? Are there other gifts and talents and other ways that we can build and shine? So I think there is a place for everyone. And I think we would just encourage folks to that are interested in learning more, or, you know, have ideas about ways that we can work together, to please feel free to be in touch, and just know that in the same ways that we're talking about staying creative and nimble, like, a really important accountability measure for us is to stay in conversation with folks like you all out there, because it means that our world and our bubble gets shaken up every time we have a new conversation. It's a good collision. So just encouraging, I think, you know, the conversations to keep going.
Very cool. Very interesting. Yeah. I mean, I definitely want to get involved in this. So that's going to be a part of my final question. This is stuff that I've thought about doing often, and I actually doing horticulture. There was 1 year, a couple of years ago, where I tried to go around and get from like farmers markets and stuff like that, and local growers, like boxes of organic food, and deliver them to local food pantries, homeless shelters. There was a domestic abuse shelter here in Libertyville where I donated to. And it was just too much for me to do alone. But it's something I really, really want to do. And so this sounds like an opportunity to get something like this organized in this area and do that amongst many other things. Like one of the things coming to mind is, Graciela talking about each individual having, talents and expertise and bringing their creative powers to a given situation. Having like free class, like if somebody knows stuff about computers, have a free class for the community to teach them about computers, whatever it be. I could teach people freely teach people about organic gardening, stuff like that. Looks like Chi plays guitar. He could, there's a guitar in the background. He could give guitar lessons to some little kid who can't afford to have them otherwise, because the lessons are expensive nowadays. Stuff like that. That's very interesting. So we got about 5 minutes left. So my final question is, if indeed somebody wanted to either just join already established mutual aid coalition, again, in your respective areas or otherwise, or start one on their own, going with the first question, go ahead.
Can it take 30 seconds?
Sure, you could take 30.
Yeah. So I think
7 seconds.
One thing I do want to acknowledge, like basically going back to add on to what Glacia was saying, like there is many folks that I've came to meet that are doing great work. And I think only 3 of us are here today, but there is a big community and like people, there's many things that I can talk about, but I actually haven't done. I think I can only be here. And I think some of us can only tell stories of things, but there is a really rich tapestry of humanity, I think, in this community that is a joy to be a part of, and so a joy to work with. And I think I want to give credit to everybody there. We don't have time to name everybody there, but it's a really rich tapestry.
That's great. So yeah, a broad spectrum of different types of people joining together, and it's what it's all about, man. I love this. I absolutely love this. So okay, anybody want to tackle the questions about like how you would join in the first place if you really want to join, or how you would start one on your own? Graciela.
Sure. I mean, I think the part about like starting one, our good friend Cosmos Ray from Bronzeville Kenwood Mutual Aid always says, if you want to start a mutual aid, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It can be as simple as just starting to have conversations with your neighbors, and really figuring out where they're at, what their needs are. Are there broader concerns that maybe folks want to organize around together? One. I also think 2, we're at such a beautiful time for mutual aid work in Chicago that, I'd love to hear from people. And I know Andrew and she would as well, but folks that are trying to build together, because there's things that we've learned, experienced that, we would love to share. So I think just to say that, to Chi's point, like we may not be the right person, but we are happy to get folks connected depending on, what mutual aid project they want to carry out. I'll kick it over to Chi or Andy just because I'm still not at home, but they might be able to share the ways to connect with the coalition on social media and other ways.
Okay, Andrew, how would one join? Are you the Portridge, or are you the?
I am from Foertsch Park. If you're in our area and you want to join up, you can drop us a line at foertschparkmutualaid@gmail.com, or just look for our group on Facebook. Just search Foertsch Park Mutual Aid on Facebook and shoot any of the admins there a message, and we'd love to get you involved. If you're not in Foertsch Park, but you're near another one of our Northwest Side neighborhoods, we can certainly link you up to the neighborhood that you're the mutual aid in your own neighborhood.
You're a Northwest. I know nothing about Chicago. I am a total suburbanite. So I don't even know if I've heard of Foertsch Park. That's Northwest. That's Northwest area.
It's like kind of on the way to O'Hare, but
not
quite. And
Gotcha.
then Irving Park is just east of us, and
Irving Park I've heard of. Yeah. Okay.
And then Graciela is in Belmont Craig, and that's just south of Foertsch Park.
Okay. Chi, any additional comments or ideas concerning either joining as a member or starting it?
Yeah, I think thinking one person as a member of it is probably sounds too official.
Too formal? Okay.
Too formal, yeah.
If you want to involve yourself in the solidarity
Yes,
of the
I
mutual
think-
aid, cool.
I really like what Glacia said. It was like, by you talking to neighbors, talking to somebody
Right.
you actually haven't talked to, that itself, in a way, is already mutual aid. And if you just search for one in your neighborhood, it's possible. If you're northwest side in Chicago, there's already one there, and get connected with them. Like for Irving Park, we're on Facebook and we're on Instagram. But I think other neighborhoods have very similar online presence as well. You can just like search for them, and if you can't find one, maybe you think about getting some folks in your neighborhood and think about what you guys need, and that might actually be the start of your neighborhood mutual aid.
Yeah, and just one other website to plug. If you go to www.chaifoodsovereignty.com, that's our page for the citywide food coalition. You can hit the contact us or the volunteer button at the top of that homepage and find out more.
All right, very cool. Well, we are at the end of the show. That flew by. That's always a testament of how interesting it is. Not even kidding. Thank you so much, all of you, for what you do and for coming on the show and telling us about this. This is extremely exciting, and I'm not kidding. I'm gonna try to get something going here because this is everything that I've thought about before doing. I just didn't feel like I had the support to do it, and so now I have a better idea of how to go about that. So thank you again, Andrew, Chi, Graciela. Thank you for coming on the show. Happy New Year. Hope everything turns out well for you. If we can get past this pandemic nonsense and get back on with our lives, that'd be great. All right. Thank you everybody for tuning into the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rich. Till next time, be good, be green.
Thanks.
Thank you